So, picture this, a nation that's been totally wiped off the map. Its capital city is just a pile of rubble, and its people are scattered across a foreign land. You'd think the story's over, right? Well, what if it wasn't? This is the amazing story of how that nation found its way back home, not in one big heroic moment, but step by step over generations.
And that's really the big question, isn't it? I mean, after 70 years stuck in exile in Babylon, after seeing Jerusalem destroyed back in 586 BC, most people would have just called it a day. They would have assumed the story of Israel was a closed book. So where do you even start to put those pieces back together? Well, the answer, as it turns out, is that you don't do it all at once. The return from exile wasn't some single event. It was a long, very deliberate, and pretty difficult process. It was a huge restoration project that unfolded in 3 totally distinct ways, each with its own special mission, stretching out over nearly 100 years. Okay, so let's dive into how they actually pulled this off. We'll look at the exile itself first, and then we'll break down the 3 big returns. And I want you to think about it like this. First, they rebuilt the nation's heart, then its soul, and finally its body. The order here is just fascinating because it tells us so much about what it really takes to bring a people back from the brink. And this timeline really gives you a bird's eye view of the whole thing. Jerusalem falls, and then the first group heads back in 538 BC. But what's really wild is the gap. Look at that. The second return doesn't happen until 458 BC. That's 80 years, an entire lifetime passed between the first wave and the second. It just goes to show this was not a quick fix. This was a multi-generational project. All right, so let's talk about that first wave. These folks had one clear priority. They finally had the chance to go home, and their focus was laser sharp. They had to rebuild the spiritual center of the nation, its very heart, the temple in Jerusalem. You know, to really get why the return was such a big deal, you have to understand the exile. For 70 long years, the people of Judah were basically prisoners in Babylon. Their whole identity as a nation was shattered. The only reason the door home even opened was because a new superpower, Persia, conquered Babylon, and its king, Cyrus the Great, issued this unbelievable decree letting the Jews go back. And the scale of this first return is just incredible. This wasn't just a handful of pioneers. We know from the records that 42,360 people, plus over 7,000 servants and 200 singers, made that long journey. You do the math, that's a group of almost 50,000 people, all heading back to rebuild from scratch. And their mission was crystal clear. First things first, they built an altar so they could start worshiping again. Then they laid the foundation for the new temple. But, you know, it wasn't easy. They faced all sorts of opposition, and it took them over 20 years before the temple was finally finished in 516 BC. So the heart was back, but the nation, it was still a long way from being whole. Okay, now fast forward. A long time. 80 years later, the whole situation is different. A new generation had grown up in Jerusalem. They had a temple, sure, but they were kind of losing touch with the laws and the culture that made them who they were. The nation's soul needed a serious reboot. I mean, think about it. The people who made that first journey were now elders or they'd passed away. Their kids and grandkids knew the stories, but they were living alongside other cultures, and their own unique identity was starting to fade. A physical building just wasn't enough to hold them together anymore. They had to rediscover who they were on the inside. So this second wave, it was way smaller, much more focused. It was led by a scribe named Ezra, and it was a group of only about 5,000 people. Their mission wasn't about construction. It was about education and spiritual renewal. You could almost call it a spiritual special ops mission, designed to restore the nation's character. Ezra's whole job was to rebuild the people. He brought the Torah, the book of the law, and he taught it to everybody. He got them to renew their promises, their covenant, and he had to tackle some tough issues, like how their culture was getting watered down. He was basically a nation builder, but his tools weren't bricks and mortar, they were scripture and conviction. And then, get this, just 13 years after Ezra shows up, the third and final piece of the puzzle falls right into place. Now that the nation had its heart back and its soul was getting renewed, it needed a body. It needed protection. It needed security. This analogy just nails it, doesn't it? Jerusalem had its temple, and its people were getting their identity back. But without walls, the city was just a cluster of buildings, totally exposed, always vulnerable to attack. It was a symbol of weakness. It just didn't have the structure or security of a real city. And then you see this number, 52 days.
It's just astonishing. Led by the governor, Nehemiah, the people, who were now totally united, rebuilt the entire defensive wall of Jerusalem in just 52 days. Think about that for a second. A ruin that had been sitting there for over 100 years was made secure in less than 2 months. Now that was a message to the world that they were truly back. So you can see how these last 2 missions just worked in perfect harmony. Ezra focused on the internal life of the nation, its spirit, its culture. Nehemiah focused on its external life, its security, its civil structure. It's such a great reminder that you absolutely need both to have a healthy, functioning community. So as we start to wrap this up, it's pretty clear that the return from exile wasn't just one big triumphant moment. It was a long, complex, multi-generational journey to rebuild a nation from the ground up, piece by essential piece. And this table really brings it all together, doesn't it? First, you have Zerubbabel restoring worship. That's the nation's heart. Then, 80 years later, Ezra comes to restore the people through the law. That's its soul. And finally, Nehemiah restores security with the walls. That's its body. Every single stage was essential, and each one built right on top of the last. You know, what this whole story proves is that restoring a nation is so much more than just a construction project. It's about patiently and methodically reviving its core, its spiritual center, its cultural identity, and its physical security. If any one of those pieces was missing, the whole thing would have been incomplete. And what's so amazing is that this ancient 3-part process feels incredibly relevant today. It makes you wonder, right? What does the story teach us about what it really takes to rebuild anything meaningful? Whether we're talking about a struggling company, a fractured community, or even just our own personal sense of who we are, this story seems to suggest it's never about one quick fix. It's about patiently rebuilding the heart, the soul, and the body.